A scraper of mine logged in once, pulled 11 pages, and then spent the next 5 hours downloading the same login form over and over. About 2,000 copies of it. The job finished on schedule. Nothing errored. Every response carried a 200 and the row count looked normal. The cause was one setting I had flipped 8 days earlier for a completely different job. Rotate the exit address on every request for the job I turned it on for. That was correct. For this one, it destroyed the entire run. Why I get to talk about this? I sell mobile proxy lines. Real SIM cards on Singapore carriers, modems on a shelf in my flat, about $10 a month per line in carrier data, and another $50 in modem depreciation. Rotation is a feature I sell, so is holding an address still. So when I tell you to rotate less, I am talking you out of the setting most people think they are paying for. I also write the scrapers, so I have been on both ends of this. What a session is from over there. Forget cookies for a moment and think about what the target has to do. Somebody arrives. The site needs to remember something about them across the next few requests, what is in the basket, whether they proved who they are. The protocol remembers nothing on its own, so the site hands out a token, a cookie usually, sometimes a header value. Whichever it is a receipt. Here is the part people skip. When the site issues that receipt, it writes down what it knew about whoever it went to. The address is the cheapest thing to write down, so the address gets written down. The receipt is a string plus a claim about where it was born. The signal is the mismatch, not the address. Now present that receipt from somewhere else. A token issued to a line in one city, handed back 3 requests later from a line 600 kilometers away. Then a third one, all inside 90 seconds. Catching that needs no fingerprinting. No behavioral model, no clever scoring. 2 fields compared against each other. And this is the bit worth sitting with. Neither address was suspicious on its own. Both were ordinary residential lines that would pass any reputation check you care to name. What got flagged was the pair of them holding the same receipt. So you can spend real money on better addresses and end up worse off. People do change address mid-session. They do, and sites handle it. You walk out of a cafe, your phone drops the Wi-Fi onto the carrier network, and your basket is still there. What a site tolerates is one change, sometimes 2, slowly between networks with some plausible relationship. What nothing tolerates is one receipt appearing on 9 networks in 4 minutes. So the question was never whether an address can change during a session. It is how often, how fast, and whether the changes have a shape a human body could produce. The things that must not rotate. There is a short list where the address has to stay put for the whole run. Anything after a login. The moment you authenticate, the site has bound something to you, and every request after that is a claim about the binding, any form with more than one step. The ones where step 2 only makes sense because step 1 happened. A basket, items go in, the server holds them, and it holds them against a session it issued. As a nation that carries a cursor, this one catches people out because from the outside it looks stateless. You see page 2 and page 3 and assume you could fetch either independently. Often you cannot. The token in that URL is a pointer into a result set the server built once and is holding for one visitor. The rule underneath all 4 is the same. If the target did anything on the first request other than hand you bytes, you are in a session and married to the address you started on. The things that can rotate freely. The other pile is genuinely fine. Independent fetches with nothing shared between them. A product page, a public listing. You ask, they answer. Neither side remembers it happened. Price checks, availability polls. The test takes 10 seconds. Could I run these requests in any order, on any day, and get the same output? If yes, rotate as hard as your supplier lets you. If the answer changes depending on what came before it, that is a session. Most real jobs are a mixture, which is the actual problem. The listing crawl is stateless, the detail pages behind the account are not, and people write one config for both. Bind the session to a worker. Here is the shape that works, and it is less code than what most people already have. Stop thinking of rotation as something that happens to a request. Make it something that happens to a worker. A worker picks up a job. It takes one exit address and holds it. Fresh cookie jar, fresh browser context. If you are driving a browser, its own everything. It does that whole job on that address, start to finish. When the job is done, the worker throws all of it away. The jar, the context, the address, anything it cached along the way. Then it picks up the next job with a new set. That is the whole pattern. Rotation still happens at the same rate as before if you want it to. It just happens between jobs rather than inside one. People do not build it this way because the request level version is one config line and the worker level version is structure you write yourself. An hour of work, maybe two. One constraint before you start. Your worker count is now your session count, so that number is doing two jobs at once. Rotate at a boundary. A boundary is a point where nothing carries across. The end of an account, the end of a search, the last page of a paginated set. The moment where, if you stopped there and never came back, nothing would be lost. Inside a job there is no such point. Looking for one is how people arrive at a compromise that fails worse than either alternative. A rotation is a reset. This is where the half measures live, so I want to be blunt about it. When you rotate, drop everything, the cookie jar, local storage, any cached token, any browser state you were carrying. New address means new person, and a new person has never been to the site before. What people do instead is rotate the address and keep the jar, because keeping the jar feels like it preserves progress. It does the exact opposite. It takes the one artifact tying those requests together and drags it across the boundary that was supposed to break the link. If you keep the jar, keep the address. If you drop the address, drop the jar. Two clean options and nothing sensible in between them. Why the middle is worse than either end. There are three ways to run this and they are nowhere near equivalent. Hold one address for the whole session and keep the jar. You read as a person on a home connection using a website, entirely ordinary. Rotate every request and destroy the jar each time. You read as a large number of unrelated first-time visitors, slightly odd, because none of them has any history, but nothing links them to each other. Rotate the address and carry the jar across. Now you have handed the target a single identifier that stitches every address you own into one set. You did not spread the load. You published an inventory, signed with the same token. That third one is what you get by default when somebody switches rotation on over a scraper that already had a cookie jar in it. It is the most common configuration I see, and the only one with no case for it at all. The position per request rotation is the default in almost every tutorial, and it is the wrong default. It made sense when the only thing anybody counted was request per address, and when the sites people scraped barely tracked sessions. That was roughly a decade ago. The sane default is sticky. Hold an address for a unit of work, rotate between units, and switch per request rotation on deliberately for the jobs where you have checked there is no state. I know how that sounds coming from me. Per request rotation is what makes people buy large pools, and large pools are what I sell. 4 sticky lines is a smaller invoice than a rotating pool of 40. I would still tell you to buy the 4. What sticky actually means. When a seller says sticky, they mean they will hand you the same exit for some window. The length of that window is the number that matters, and it usually lives in small text. 10 minutes is common, 30 exists. Some let you hold until you release it yourself. So measure your longest single session before you buy, then buy a window longer than that. A job that runs 12 minutes on a 10-minute window fails in the middle, which is the worst place for it. Ask what happens at the end of the window too. Does it hold until your connection closes or cut mid-request? Only one of those is safe to run a checkout through. The failure is silent. Almost none of this arrives as an error. When a session breaks, the site does not refuse you. It stops recognizing you. So you get a login page with a 200 on it, or an empty basket, or page 1 of the results instead of page 4. Status code monitoring says fine. The row count says fine, because a login page is a row. The shape of the data is the only place it shows up. So assert on something that can only exist inside a live session. A username in the header, an order reference, a field that only renders once you are through the door. If that marker is missing, fail the request loudly, even though the server told you everything was fine. I run that check on the first request after every rotation now, because that is where it breaks, if it is going to. What I got wrong. Back to the 2000 login pages. The rotation setting was only half of it. The config was global. One proxy setup shared by every job in that project. because at the time that looked tidy. So a change made for a stateless listing crawl landed on an authenticated job nobody was thinking about. The other half was my success check. A status code and a row count, both of which a login page clears comfortably. The fix took an afternoon per job proxy config, so a stateless crawl and an authenticated crawl can no longer share a setting. Worker level session binding. One assertion on a field that only exists when you are logged in. The part that still annoys me is the 11 good pages at the start. It worked briefly, so the smoke test passed, and it only went wrong at request 12 when the first rotation happened. Anything that works for 10 requests and then quietly stops is now a session problem in my head until something proves otherwise. It usually is one. Where this stops being enough, there are targets that bind a session to more than the address. If the site fingerprints the browser and ties the token to that as well, holding your address is necessary and nowhere near sufficient. I am not going to pretend I have solved that one. I also cannot tell you how any particular site does its binding. I infer it from the outside, from what breaks when I change one thing at a time, and I have been wrong more than once. Anybody who tells you exactly what a target checks without working there is guessing. The worker level pattern written out properly and the checks I run on the first request after a rotation are at proxyscraping.org. Subscribe for more on proxies for scraping.